Good evening and welcome to Broadcasting Scotland. It's Monday the 30th of August and this is Scotland at 7. I'm Andrew Wilson and this evening I'm hosting the programme from Edinburgh. First we will look at today's coronavirus update, then I will introduce this evening's guest, and then we will discuss the stories behind today's news headlines together. Firstly, as of 2 p.m. today, since the start of the pandemic, a total of 2,738,930 people in Scotland have been tested through the NHS Scotland labs and UK government regional testing centres. Of these, 2,314,422 have been confirmed negative and 424,508 have tested positive. There are 3,893 new cases of COVID-19 confirmed by a test, although not everyone with the virus will display symptoms and not all those with symptoms will be tested. I'm pleased to say that there are no new reported deaths of people who have tested positive. The number of patients in Scotland who have died from complications caused by the coronavirus infection now stands at 8,111. This number only includes those who have died having received a positive test for the virus in the previous 28 days. Of the people who have tested positive, 551 were in hospital last night, 52 of whom were in intensive care. As of 8 a.m. this morning, 4,103,687 people had received their first dose of the COVID-19 vaccination, and 3,668,041 had received their second dose. The latest UK daily figures show that 132,485 patients who tested positive for COVID-19 have sadly died from their illness, and that is an increase of 48 since yesterday. This number refers to deaths in all settings, not just hospitals. Now, we are lucky enough to be joined this evening by Peter Curran. Peter was a personnel and HR professional with a number of very large corporations, and now that he has retired, he is a noted commentator and writer. Peter, thank you for joining us this evening on Scotland at 7. How are you this evening?
I'm fine, recovering from invasions of successive waves of family and visitors, which have gone on all week. Breathing space for the moment.
Well, I'm glad to hear that. I'm not surprised that they've been clamouring to come and see you, but I'm glad that you're getting a chance to recover today as well. We'll go with our first story, which is that the First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, has announced her intention to appoint 2 new ministers following the approval of the historic Bute House Agreement. For the first time anywhere in the UK, members of the Green Party will enter government, and for the first time since devolution, a formal cooperation agreement will be in place in Scotland. Patrick Harvie will be Minister for Zero Carbon Buildings, Active Travel and Tenants' Rights, working with the Housing Secretary and Net Zero Secretary. Mr Harvie's responsibilities will include driving policy changes that shift Scotland away from reliance on high carbon modes of transport and heating and towards greener alternatives, essential as part of the push towards a net zero economy by 2045. Ensuring fairness during that transformation will also be key, and Mr Harvie will lead on delivering a new deal for tenants and ensuring that building standards are fit for purpose. Lorna Slater will take on the role of Minister for Green Skills, Circular Economy and Biodiversity, working with the Finance and Economy Secretary and the Net Zero Secretary. Ms Slater will drive a green industrial strategy, helping people across access training and opportunities as part of a Net Zero Scotland, and ensuring our economy is supported through a just transition to net zero. Supporting biodiversity and protecting our national parks and natural heritage will also form part of Ms Slater's role, working closely with Nature Scot and Zero Waste Scotland, and supporting the development of a circular economy that minimises the impact on our natural environment. The First Minister said, "This historic cooperation agreement is founded in a shared drive to work together in the Scottish Government to build a greener, fairer, independent Scotland." So Peter, first of all, It seems over the weekend that the process begun with the announcement of the Butte House Agreement has continued to make progress and move forwards. We know that the agreement was supported and approved by members of the Green Party and members of the SNP separately over the weekend. What's your reaction to the news that the plan that was set out when the announcement a week ago is starting to move forwards?
Delight, Andrew, and relief that the vote went okay. I mean, at the end of the day, I was sure the Green membership would realise the enormous significance and benefits of this, but there was always that worry that we would have had egg in our face monumentally if we'd said no. The other thing is, of course, the significance of this has been demonstrated abundantly by the blind funk that it's thrown the unionist camp into. I mean, I've enlisted everybody in their granny to find something wrong with it, ranging from pseudo analytical dissections of the significance of this deal to oblique snipes in one way and another. I mean, the reality of it is, if you take the unionist main argument, this isn't about climate change, it isn't about green agenda, it's all about independence. The simple answer to that: independence is a key precursor to effectively allowing Scotland to deliver its full potential in delivering climate change. And to carry this agreement into the whatever involvement Scotland has in COP26, when the eyes of the world literally will be on Scotland, and some very big names in the world will be in Scotland and in my native city, Glasgow. It's of incalculable significance. So everything for me is going for the deal. I'm a great admirer of the intellect, as displayed regularly, of Patrick Harvey and Lorna Slater. Deeply disappointed that neither of them see fit to follow me, but there you are. A minor blip on their green horizon. Maybe I'll just get spiteful about it somewhere along the line. I wish them very well. And as for their job descriptions, I mean, one way to neuter your opponents is to give them a job. Or not your opponents, but people you're working with you who you want to marginalise, which is not the case here, is to give them a job description which constrains them. The reality is good people are never constrained by their job description. It's the intellectual contribution they make to discharging that job description has much wider influence than any words on a piece of paper about duties. So I'm sure Patrick Harvey and Lorna Slater will do the job description impeccably, but will also fan out into a much wider influence on the SNP cabinet, which I think is sorely needed and very welcome.
That's a good point that you make, Peter. I was going to ask you, with both Green co-leaders being appointed or to be appointed ministers if they are approved by the Parliament, and with a guaranteed majority, you would expect that they will be approved. With both Green co-leaders being ministers, how do you think that will play out at Holyrood?
I think some feathers will be ruffled. And in some cases, no name is no pack drill. I think the sharp contrast between the incisive analytical minds of both Harvey and Slater will be slightly difficult for some people who shall remain nameless. But I think they both have the necessary skills to handle. I mean, Lorna Slater particularly seems to be a very feet on the ground Canadian realist, and in the best sense of that nation. So I think they'll work well. I mean, the Greens are going to grab this with both hands, and they're not going to do anything stupid, I hope.
Thanks, Peter. And thinking again more generally about the preamble and the context into which the Butte House Agreement has been placed by both parties, what odds do you give for what is said to be a new way of doing politics working together in Scotland? What odds do you give for that taking root?
Well, a new way of doing politics. I'd be happy if we actually rediscovered some older ways. I mean, we seem to have drifted over the last decade into an appalling debasement of our politics. So if we could recover something of the sense of mission, of honour, of willingness to take responsibility, and of constantly using what I always use called the helicopter approach, the ability to rise above the terrain, take a broad picture, look at the big picture, the big viewpoint, and then home in the detail and come out again. The Greens have always homed in on the big picture, but I think it's a great opportunity for them to get their helicopter on the ground more often and come to grips with realities, and for the SNP cabinet to get off the ground a bit and take account of the wider picture. So I'm hoping they will both become, both sides will become expert helicopter pilots and will go up and down in the best sense of the word.
It's a good point that you make. The first two Scottish parliaments, after the parliament reconvened in 2000, the first two parliaments were subject to informal cooperation agreements between the Labour Party and the Lib Dems. So in a sense, it's not something new. However, I think in the context of this particular agreement, where there's very clearly defined exceptions to the agreement, that might be said to be something different. And how do you think that will operate? Or what do you think the challenges will be in operating that process of exceptions? For example, will Greens be allowed to question the First Minister's questions on the topics that are excluded from the Bute House Agreement, or how do you think we're going to make that work?
Well, that's a fascinating question, Andrew, because really it bears in on the issue of cabinet responsibility, which is normally interpreted as the arguments are kept within the cabinet room, and no matter how difficult the argument was and how much one party may disagree with it, outside the cabinet room they maintain a solidarity. So just as ministers by and large don't contradict each other in First Minister's questions or in media interviews, you would expect that, but this is not exactly a cabinet, and yet what is it? They're ministers. They're part of the government. The piece of advice I would give them, completely arrogant, I should offer any advice to two such experienced politicians, is do a lot more arm twisting than you've done before, but please, for God's sake, don't do it in public. So I have no problems at all if they put Nicola and the members of the cabinet in an arm lock and say, if you don't do this, we'll do things you won't like. But I want them to do it out of visibility from anybody else. I think the Greens, perhaps, maybe for the best of motives, maybe for other reasons we may speculate about, didn't use their clout as they might have done. And of course, it involves making big threats. I mean, presumably they could stop a budget. To also, in theory, they could possibly bring the plan to a sudden end. You know, now, these are the exocet things which I think nobody wants to contemplate. But when you're dealing with somebody in a negotiation, it will be a state of permanent negotiation between the Greens and the SNP, with the SNP being the down-hard realpolitik. Look at the jobs, look at the impact of, and the Greens saying, yes, but for God's sake, rise above that and look at the planet. And somehow they're going to have to reconcile. And I believe they will. I believe Nicola has the intellect and a few others on the SNP benches, and to have two first class, I repeat it, and it's not a piece of crawling, I've no aspirations to be a Green or anything else. I think Patrick Harvey and Lorna Slater will handle it well.
And finally on this topic, Peter, you touched very briefly at the beginning about the reaction that we have seen from the unionist parties to the progress that's being made with the agreement. I was reflecting over the weekend that we perhaps saw in English politics or UK politics that once Boris Johnson had secured a significant majority, it very much sucked the air out of the opposition, who then found themselves unable to do very much because the government could do pretty much whatever it wanted. Do you think this effectively guaranteed majority for the SNP Green coalition, do you think that will do the same? Do you think it will suck the air out of whatever opposition we have in Holyrood?
Well, the only air in the opposition in Holyrood is bad air. I mean, there used to be an old jazz song at the turn of the 20th century called, it was brutal realism, a funky butt. And it was the fact that the smell of bodies and the little dance halls of the period demanded that the windows be opened periodically. So, yeah, let's get rid of the opposition bad air. I mean, some of the recent behaviour of the Tory opposition, I mean, it beggars belief. It's infantile. I mean, it's not politics. This is children's yaboo.
Absolutely right, Peter. And undoubtedly, you and I will be discussing this agreement again as it unfolds on Scotland at 7 in the future, and I look forward to that too. We'll move to our next story now. The Scottish, Welsh and Northern Irish governments have joined forces to write to the Secretary of State for Work and Pensions, repeating their urgent call for the UK government to reverse its plans to cut the £20 increase to universal credit that was introduced during the pandemic. The joint letter to Therese Coffey from our Social Justice Secretary Shona Robinson, the Welsh Social Justice Minister Jane Hutt, and the Northern Ireland Communities Minister Deirdre Hargey points out that the UK government's plans will cost people over £1,000 a year at a time when they need financial support the most. The letter states, "This planned withdrawal will be the biggest overnight reduction to a basic rate of social security since the modern welfare state began more than 70 years ago. It could cut social security payments in Scotland alone by over £460 million per year by 2023-24. We are concerned about the potential impact that reducing universal credit will have on child poverty, poverty levels, and the financial health and well-being of people. We urge the UK government to reverse the decision without delay in order to avoid causing further anxiety." So, Peter, first of all, what do you think the chances are? What chances do you give this letter of reversing Therese Coffey's plan to take £1,000 a year from our poorest families?
I'm tempted to say negligible. I mean, I must confess to an ignoble reaction sometimes to the repeated SNP press releases that come out on this issue. And then I have to remind myself, this is a real issue that affects loads of families deeply, and it matters to a lot of people. And it exhibits the dilemma of being a devolved government seeking independence, that you're trying to make the system work while you have it, while seeking to abolish it. But I mean, trying to get rational behaviour or human behaviour from this government, it's hard not to despair on the face of it. I mean, you've only got to look at Dominic Raab. Now, I know he's not in charge of it, but his behaviour in the face of this Afghanistan major humanitarian crisis beggars belief. Priti Patel is little better, if any. And you say, how can we address a government with that lack of humanity, empathy, or even basic political nous? And yet you mustn't despair. I suppose you have to try while remembering it isn't the solution. The solution is independence.
Absolutely. Now, there's been, if the prospects for the SNP and the devolved administrations are negligible, there has also been some talk over the weekend about backbench Tory MPs being unhappy with the plan. I suspect probably backbench Tory MPs in the north and the northeast of England in particular. Do you think that backbench Tory MPs have a chance of changing this plan?
In the right political context and behind the scenes on the corridors of Westminster, it must be possible, and it's in the very nature of politics, and it must be possible that people who disagree fundamentally on their core values and almost everything, there are things that they agree on, and even if they don't care about this issue, they recognise that it's an issue, an electoral issue, and it can affect them. So Boris might feel free to ignore the devolved nations, but if the proper kind of behind-the-scenes alliance and careful avoidance of public statements that that was formed, I think it's in everybody's interest that this is done, and it's certainly in the people's interests who are being cruelly affected by it. So I can only hold out hopes that they can do that. Ian Blackford, who I'm sometimes critical of, but I do believe he has that parliamentarian instinct, and he probably does an enormous amount of stuff behind the scenes that's useful and practically helps people. So a very difficult balance to find, and I don't envy them, but I can only hope that it could work.
Thanks, Peter. We'll move to our next story now, and that is to catch up on the latest reporting of events that are taking place in Afghanistan. US anti-missile defenses have intercepted as many as 5 rockets targeting Kabul airport as key American diplomats flew out of the Afghan capital in the final hours of the Western evacuation under the threat of further Islamic State attacks. Officials told Reuters that core US diplomats had today joined the 122,000 foreign nationals and Afghans to be evacuated since the middle of August, although it was not clear whether the acting US ambassador, Ross Wilson, was amongst them. The last few hundred US troops are due to pull out of the country by Joe Biden's Tuesday deadline, drawing to a close their country's longest military conflict, which began 20 years ago in retaliation for the 11 September 2001 9/11 attacks. No casualties were reported from the rockets fired on Monday morning. IS, which opposes both the West and the Taliban, claimed responsibility. In Scotland, an SNP MSP is urging the UK government to use around 100 empty houses, formerly used as accommodation for MOD staff, to provide homes for refugees fleeing Afghanistan. Siobhan Brown, who's the MSP for Ayr, has said the empty houses can be used to house families in South Ayrshire and that the area is ready to accept and welcome Afghan families. The homes, which are mostly situated around Prestwick Airport, have been left empty ever since the helicopter search and rescue operation HMS Gannet was privatised and decommissioned in 2016. Earlier this year, it was revealed that nearly 11,000 MOD homes are empty across the UK, with 900 unused in Scotland. So, Peter, first of all, what's your reflection on the latest news from Afghanistan today?
Well, it's complex in the extreme. Let me follow my own model and do the helicopter effect and rise above a multiplicity of pressing and tragic and, in some cases, appalling issues that have to be grasped from this. Let's get above this. The American 20-year involvement in Afghanistan in nation building, which Tony Blair was rash enough to call it, has failed. And it's not only failed, it has failed embarrassingly. That's not to minimize good that was done, and there's no doubt that a lot of good was done by good people, because good people can be caught up in bad causes and still manage to do good. And I recognize that the teachers, even among the military, who did good things. But the reality is we now have Afghanistan in control, in inverted commas, of the Taliban. The big players in the game have all grouped fascinatingly today in their commentaries, and they're all sending a similar message. Russia, China, neighboring countries, even from within Afghanistan itself, in saying it's in nobody's interest that this country turns into a haven for random and vicious international terrorism. But the pre-requirement of doing that is whatever we think of the Taliban, and people have a range of views on it. Mine is, I've stated it many times, that their record is beyond question. It's appalling and would be defined by any standard of morality I know as wrong, evil, and inhumane. But we're at where we're at. So an accommodation, an understanding has to be reached with the Taliban. Now, the big question that all of these nations are asking is, has the Taliban changed? And the BBC seems determined, they may say they're simply reporting facts, to match up indications of you cannot believe a word that the Taliban says, because the Taliban are bad people, and look, they did this, and this today. And they have done appalling things. An appalling thing has just been done by the US government. They've carried out a drone strike on, and this is their words, the Pentagon's words, a suspected terrorist responsible for the attack on Kabul airport. And in the process of that drone strike, although the facts have not been fully determined, men, women, and children who clearly were not terrorists have been killed. At least 6 children have died. And the report today said they were so badly burned that they couldn't be individually identified by their relatives. Now, this wasn't invented. This is not some sort of mysterious Taliban propaganda. We know how these drone strikes are done. We've seen them in 1,000 US blockbuster movies. The high legions get into a big room safely with a few gin and tonics and watch a screen, and suddenly a piece of desert and a few tents and a few human beings are obliterated. That's the modern world. The Pentagon dialogue has shifted material in the course of the discussion in the day to saying, but we were targeting what we believed was a car carrying a car bomb on a suicide mission headed for Kabul airport. Now, I realize in times of extremist war, civilized behavior is abandoned in many cases. But we somehow have to take the big picture here. And the big picture has a secondary aspect that all of these big countries are going to be involved in COP26. They realize that the elements in which the world, the major powers in the world, have to come together or we're going to fall apart. So the complexities of this is difficult. On the ground, we've got a marked contrast of an appalling humanitarian crisis, which I have to say was inevitable. I mean, anybody who says we could not foresee this wasn't looking at the reality. I mean, a population has been put in dependency mode for 20 years by the presence of the American military, and British military. Whatever good they were doing, they weren't doing good. Good, brave men were being maimed and losing their lives trying to help another country. I recognize that aspect of it fully and sympathize and empathize with the mothers. But we've created a situation where the collapse of the Afghanistan government, the collapse of the Afghanistan army, after 20 years of training and input of weapons, etc. We have now armed the Taliban, given them a road system, given them vehicles, given them all sorts of things. And that collapse indicated failure. You cannot do another state's democratic duty for it. So somehow we have to focus everything on the humanitarian crisis. And Russia is saying today, do this. I stumbled on flicking channels just before I come on. I thought, have a look at RT. I always, you know my views on RT, but it's a propaganda channel funded by the Kremlin. But who was on but Tariq Ali? Tariq Ali, famous crusader. And there he was, and somebody with intimate knowledge of the Indian subcontinent, talking about these things and begging for some kind of realism and balance in this argument. So this is going to summon the deep reserves of humanity and statesmanship of every country in the world if we're to approach this rationally. We can't undo what's been done. We can't blame it on Biden. We can't even blame it on Trump. This is a collective failure of America and Britain. I've just got a book delivered today. I don't know a great deal about it, but it interested me, the subject matter. And at my left and right here. Here it is. Mm-hmm. Not going in the right direction. Get it to the camera.
Yes. There we go.
The Great Imperial Hangover by a guy called Sami Puri, a very respected academic, think tank member, etc. And this is what we're seeing enacted in front of us. We're seeing attitudes that have come from the heyday of the British Empire, of America's empire, always denied Arabic. There are things go back here to the legacy of the Ottoman Empire and deals done in the First World War. There's a mindset that has to be abandoned if we're to come into the kind of world we want, of rational world politics within a framework of sovereign nations. Somehow we've got to grow up as a species. Otherwise, we don't deserve the name Homo sapiens. As I've said before, properly should be called Homo dopians. for the way we're behaving. I don't think we've evolved as fast as our armaments have, and that's the up and down of it. So
sounds like the problem. Thanks,
all we
Peter.
can do is do what we can.
That sounds absolutely right. Thank you. We'll move to our next story now, and that's to come back to matters rather more domestic. The UK government has rejected calls from retail and logistics companies to temporarily ease post-Brexit immigration rules, which they say are contributing to a shortage of truck drivers and acute supply chain disruption. Fast food chains McDonald's, KFC and Nando's, as well as the bakery chain Greggs, have all faced disruption this week as suppliers struggle to deliver to them. Trade body Logistics UK said that the UK currently had a shortage of 90,000 truck drivers, and on August the 22nd, it and the British Retail Consortium asked the government to grant temporary visas to truck drivers from the European Union. Since the 1st of January, most EU citizens planning to work in Britain need visas, which are typically only available for higher paid jobs than those in the logistics and hospitality sectors. The UK government said on Saturday it did not expect that these visa rules to change. We want to see employers making long-term investments in the UK domestic workforce instead of relying on labour from abroad, a government spokesman said. Alex Veitch, the General Manager for Public Policy at Logistics UK, said he was disappointed by the government's decision, as it could take until early next year to work through the backlog of driving tests that had built up during the COVID-19 pandemic, and the UK needs drivers now. So, Peter, on the presumption that it will take up to a year to bring UK-based Class 1 HGV drivers into the workforce, what is to be done in the intervening 12 months?
God alone knows is the answer. You're back to the old question, if you want to get somebody asking directly, you want to get there, I wouldn't start from here. I don't think people realise just how significant HGV drivers are in the life of the nation. I mean, over the last 20 years or more, we've built a whole logistic structure around the concept of just in time. But big factories and suppliers don't carry huge warehouses with huge inventories. The inventory is in effect carried on the road by big lorries. Now, these big lorries, they have a responsibility in some respects which is more arduous than that of a train driver. Looking for safety, for not overworking their drivers, for not falling asleep at the wheel. Not so long ago. These jobs are undervalued, undertrained, and the possession of the HGV qualification, many qualifications are just a sort of loose indication of your fitness for a job. The HGV 1 and 2 qualifications are absolutely fundamental to safe driving. Why was this not anticipated? Where is our much wanted civil service? Where are the planners who are supposed to be doing these things? There's only two explanations. One, they were incompetent and government ministers didn't recognise it. They were competent and government ministers didn't listen to them. The explanation has to lie within that. The only rational way to alleviate it would be to relax the idiot constraints that Brexit has placed upon us. But this government, who owes its existence, its very cabinet survival, to the lies of Brexit, is to the last people in the world to get it right. Again, if they won't listen to humane argument or logical argument, they have to be hit hard in their pocketbooks. I mean, the Tories will listen to one thing, two things above all: their electoral prospects, if an election is near, and the money aspect. And the Financial Times, I'm sure, is expressing great concern about this, because when push comes to shove, the Financial Times, money ain't funny. They can take a humane, purposeful line in a lot of things, but ultimately it comes down to the hard cash in the stock market. So I have no remedies for it. Yeah.
Absolutely. Thanks, Peter. We'll also talk about another Brexit benefit, if I can call it that. A South African doctor and her UK citizen husband are living on either side of the Irish border because of the borderline unconstitutional application of post-Brexit immigration rules. Corinne and Brett Giles live 25 miles apart in Donegal and Derry counties, respectively, with Corinne in a constant state of anxiety, waiting for a family permit to join her husband in the UK. The A&E doctor who worked on the COVID frontline is out of a job and living out of a suitcase because she felt that she could not extend her contract in Ireland as she was imminently emigrating to the UK. 8 months on, she faces having to go back to South Africa as her residency rights in Ireland have come to an end. She could risk the threat of deportation if she was caught illegally entering Northern Ireland. Since the UK left the EU, UK citizens' non-UK spouses need to apply for pre-settled status before the 29th of March next year if they want to return as a family to the country visa-free. They are eligible only if they get a new EU family permit for the UK first. Before Brexit, UK nationals' relatives could return to the UK at any time without visas under free movement laws that apply to EU and non-EU spouses. Post-Brexit, that route ended, but the UK government, under pressure, pledged to keep the visa-free door open until March next year. After 15 years in South Africa, the Gileses moved to Ireland 2 years ago, wanting to be closer to family in the UK, while Corinne worked at the Letterkenny University Hospital's A&E unit. Their saga began 8 months ago on starting to explore their options to move to England. They discovered that there was a visa-free route for Corinne under a Brexit side deal, which allows non-EU nationals entry to the UK as long as they first get a family permit from the Home Office. Brett, who works in marketing, moved across the border to Derry in Northern Ireland, having read guidance on the government's website that UK citizens should return to the UK before the end of December last year to exercise his EU freedom of movement rights. The website said a family permit would take a few weeks to process, which he saw as a small price to pay. 5 months later, however, there is no sign of the family permit and no communication from the Home Office other than to say the application is in the system. Meanwhile, Corinne, 48, lives in a single room in Letterkenny and is unable to apply to fill health service vacancies in Ireland or in England's NHS. Brett's MP, the SDLP leader Colin Eastwood, who has been working with the couple, said they have been met with obstinacy from the Home Office at every turn and questioned how the Home Office cannot carry out the necessary checks in this time frame. So, Peter, you were talking about the performance of ministers and civil servants a moment ago. What do you think that this story, this news today, tells us about the risks of relying on HM government?
Well, there's always a story which somehow epitomizes a bigger, more complex problem, and this is clearly an example of that. If I just, for a moment at least, may go on a lighter note, as a schoolboy in the 1940s, I crossed multiple borders in my mile and a half to school. I moved out of Dunchatton Street, across Duke Street, out of the Welsh gang territory,
Yes.
into the territory of the Stickett gang, which was based in Barrack Street, and then imperceptibly into the territory of the old Billy Boys and the Sam Toy. And they all had to be navigated with considerable care and attention, in my case, particularly on St. Patrick's Day. I remember light-hearted things about the border between England and Scotland. And they were talking to children who lived within yards of each other on either side of the border. And the interviewer said, "What do you call that?" to those in the English side. And they said, "My ear." And they said to the Scots boy who lived a few yards away, "What do you call that?" He said, "My lug." So these things always exist at borders, but they ain't funny anymore. Again, I come back to what I said earlier. What the hell has happened with our civil? We had a civil service, which in many respects was the envy of the world. The Home Office was never the envy of anywhere. I mean, the Home Office has been unfit for purpose for as long as I can remember. whether it was under Theresa May or whoever. I never thought anybody could be as heartless as Theresa May was, believe it or not, in her Home Office days. But Priti Patel certainly outstripped her by a country mile. But again,
Absolutely.
nobody seemed to foresee all these difficulties. I mean, the EU wasn't particularly good at it, and the whole question of what arguments should be used for and against Brexit bedeviled it. Because in Scotland, much of the argument swung about saying, don't be negative about Brexit, we have to focus on the positive benefits of the EU. And the other side saying, it's always scare stories about Brexit. With the benefit of hindsight, maybe we needed more scare stories about Brexit, not about bogeymen, but saying, here are the practicalities. How will you do this? How will you do that? Here's the rational implications of creating a border again, a hard border where one didn't exist before. We were singularly unprepared at every level. I blame certainly the Tory government and the Brexiters within it. I also blame the EU and I blame the Scottish and devolved government. None of them thought this through. Politicians are very prone to say, when asked to get down to the nitty-gritty, well, that's a hypothetical. I can't deal with hypotheticals. Forward planning is about dealing with hypotheticals. It's about dealing with what if, and finding at least provisional answers, risk assessments, or even uncertainty assessments such as you can. But
absolutely.
I don't know.
Thanks, Peter. Thanks, Peter.
Yeah.
We'll move on to our next story now. We'll come back to Scotland. The Assistant Chief Constable Bernard Higgins has issued the following statement on anti-Irish Catholic singing by a group in Glasgow city centre on Sunday the 29th of August. ACC Higgins said, "We did not facilitate this event, and to say so is inaccurate. Officers on patrol came across a group as it was making its way through Glasgow city centre. Due to the numbers and to ensure public and officer safety, additional officers were called to assist, and at this point individuals' details were noted and the group dispersed. A retrospective investigation into this anti-Irish Catholic singing has been launched, and we are following up a number of lines of inquiry, including reviewing CCTV footage and footage on social media. I fully expect a number of arrests to be made. This type of anti-Irish Catholic behaviour is wholly unacceptable. Our inquiries are ongoing to identify those who were involved, and we will take the appropriate action against them. We would ask anyone who has any information that could assist our investigation to contact us." However, the challenges of the sectarianism still evident in some parts of Scotland are a much broader societal problem, and whilst policing will have a role to play in addressing the symptoms, its causes are a problem which require a more effective, joined-up civic response. Now, Peter, I know that you are not a football fan, so we will look at broader issues here of public order, policing and sectarianism in 21st century Scotland. What do you think of ACC Higgins' statement this morning?
Well, I've looked at the statement, I've looked at the multiple comments on Twitter and press, the photographs and the videos of it. May I be forgiven for interjecting something light-hearted at this point, but it has a serious point, because I do believe this is a serious issue. I'm not trying to devalue it with humour. Many years ago, when I worked in a factory, there was a convener of shop stewards, a lovely guy. I liked him. We had a drink together, etc. But he was what you would call a hardcore blue nose. He made no secret of his allegiances. He also had a very good singing voice, and we were at a party together where the group was fairly mixed across the football support and the sectarian divide. And the hostess said to Tommy, give us a song, but you know what this group's like, don't sing any sectarian songs. And he said, well, what do you want me to sing? She said, well, I'm an old fan of the old Johnny Ray song, Cry. And Tommy said, yeah, fine, I'll sing that. And she said, now, Tommy Duffy's going to sing us a song. A bit of silence for Tommy. Tommy picked up a scarf and said, the cry was no surrender. And then all hell broke loose in a tenement flat. So sectarian singing is funny, it's entertaining, and it's also infinitely dangerous in the wrong context. But we have a parliament who sensibly, I thought, tried to come to grips with it. Not an easy thing to come to grips with. They passed legislation on it, and they were attacked from both sides. And the very Celtic supporters and Celtic people who are on that side of the divide in journalism, and we need only point to the Herald, vitriolically, if there's such a word, criticised the Scottish government sectarian singing thing because it was denying people this God-given right to God to bawl out their prejudices in public and inflame other people and cause blood and mayhem on the streets. And now they're whinging about it. I mean, either we deal with this problem or we don't. The clubs themselves, but on their grave face, say we don't condone. The clubs have remedies. I mean, I see the police are now saying they're going to cope with it. I do think the police were a bit unfairly pilloried here by saying they were facilitating this march by wandering beside it. Well, I mean, that's the police's job to walk beside marches, whatever they're doing. And not to suddenly rush in among them with a billy club and say, I don't like that song. They would instantly have then accused the police of being sectarianly divided. Now, the police are representative of the population. If they're not police. The police are the citizens in uniform, and they have to manage their own loyalties, perhaps even their own prejudices, and enforce the law objectively. So they've got an unenviable task. This is not a problem with the police or about the police, in my view. It's a problem of the politicians and the journalists and the media who really have to, as sensible people, get their act together in this. Either we need to legislation to control it, we need to use existing legislation, or we don't. But for God's sake, don't hang about in the middle and then become sanctimonious when there's a march that you don't like.
Absolutely. Thanks, Peter. We'll look at one more story now. And fire has ripped through a 20-story residential building in Milan, leaving rescue workers scrambling to make sure that no one had been caught in the flames and thick smoke. The blaze on Sunday started on the upper floors of the tower on the southern outskirts of the capital of the Lombardy region. The flames then spread to the lower levels, causing thick smoke, the fire services said on Twitter. The building houses about 70 families who were being contacted in an effort to make sure that no one was missing. The firemen are going from apartment to apartment, knocking down doors to make sure that no one remains inside, the Milan mayor Giuseppe Sala told the Corriere della Sera newspaper. But we are optimistic because people had time to get out, he added. According to the authorities, about 20 residents suffered slight smoke inhalation. Dozens of ambulances and fire engines were at the scene. All the residents who were in their apartments when the fire broke out, about 30 people, were all safely evacuated. They said the flames spread through the cladding on the facade, which was supposed to have been fire-resistant, Corriere della Sera reported. Prosecutors in Milan have launched an investigation to determine the cause of the fire. According to Carlo Sibia, an interior ministry official in Rome, the rapid spread of the flames was due to the thermal covering of the building. Authorities now fear the building is at risk of collapse due to the high temperatures that could have melted the steel columns. The 60-metre-tall building was designed to look like the keel of a ship. It included an aluminium sail on its roof, which burned after the blaze, falling in pieces to the street. These events, Peter, have a striking sense of déjà vu about them, although thankfully on this occasion no lives were lost. So it strikes me, if as reported the flames spread down this building, then that it sounds like there must have been something on the building that was very flammable.
I mean, déjà vu is the word. I mean, what leaped immediately to mind, obviously, is Grenfell Tower. And you say to yourself, how the news of Grenfell Tower, not the ultimate towering inferno, in many respects more horrific than the 70s film of towering inferno was. Did that not penetrate to Italy about cladding? And I, as a resident of Glasgow for the first 25 years of my life, have a long memory of Glasgow fires. I mean, I was in the latter stages of my engagement doing up our house that we're about to move in a few weeks' time. and come back into Glasgow in the bus and saw a strange red glow in the sky. And I didn't know at that point it was the Cheapside Street fire. And the workers, the young women and people in, were screaming from behind barred windows in a whiskey warehouse. And brave firemen in the street trying to fight it were killed by the exploding spirit within falling on top of them. I remember an even older one in Argyle Street where a store went on fire and girls were jumping from the roof onto a plastic awning. Glasgow is horrific. So that surprised me. And the results, I worked in a highly dangerous industry, the tire industry, using inflammable substances, toxin, a derivative of petroleum, dangerous processes, carbon black, dust explosions, safety and major incidents happened. And I won't go into the horrors. There is a remedy for all of this, almost a remedy. And it's one that's sedulously been avoided by every government and every politician everywhere. When this happens, the people responsible for it have to be identified at board level of the companies that caused this, not some scapegoat on the ground. No corporate manslaughter exerting what looks like a big fine in companies who can well afford it. The directors with a direct line of responsibility for this have to be jailed as if they had killed somebody in the street by extraordinary negligence. That's the only thing that will stop this kind of. And look at Grenfell. Who has been held responsible for that? After all this time, and there are still buildings with the same cladding and the same dangers, and people living in them, looking at their property values collapsing and terrified for their young families, but with no options open to them. So, these things just should not be happening in any society that calls itself civilized. And it's sheer expediency and greed and criminal negligence. The Americans have a name for it: reckless indifference. We have to deal with.
Absolutely, Peter. And your point about the Cheapside Street whiskey warehouse disaster in March 1960 is well made. Anytime I'm walking up Gordon Street, I always stop and look at the statue to Glasgow firefighters outside Central Station. What I will do, however, is move to our final story this evening, and that is that Michael Gove has been filmed geeing at Laldy in an Aberdeen nightclub after reportedly trying to dodge the £5 entrance fee by stating that he was the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster. Footage of the recently separated former Vote Leave Supremo throwing shapes at 1:15 a.m. in the Bohemia nightclub circulated on the internet on Sunday in a clip filmed by a fellow clubber. Friends of Gove denied that he had attempted to avoid paying. The 54-year-old cabinet minister who grew up in Aberdeen was on a trip to see family when he apparently walked into a Neil's bar at 1:15 in the morning. After last orders were called, Gove was urged by drinkers to join them upstairs at the club Bohemia, where he reportedly stayed until at least 2:30 a.m. The footage emerged just as the cabinet minister was being tipped to replace Dominic Raab as Foreign Secretary in a reshuffle later this year or in early 2022. Gove and the journalist Sarah Vine announced their separation 2 months ago after 20 years of marriage and are in the process of getting divorced. So, Peter, this has to be the silliest story of the week so far. What's your reaction to the story and the video of the 54-year-old raver cavorting on his own in the wee small hours of the morning?
Well, I found it funny, like everybody else, in one sense. I'm very reluctant to go into the moralities of politicians unless they really impinge on some fundamental way or the behaviour of politicians. I mean, Michael Gove, I do not like. Even if he was a decent politician, I wouldn't like him. I've got a Dr. Fell thing about him. There's something about him. I do not like the Dr. Fell, exactly why I cannot tell, but I do not like the Dr. Fell. I think it's that lower lip, that wet underlip. I'm surprised he was able to dance without falling over it. I thought he might have stood in his bottom lip while he was trying to dance. But the only advice I would give to politicians, if you're going to make an arsehole of yourself, learn to dance before you do it. I mean, people compared it to dad, and God knows my attempts at dancing have reduced my family to hysterics on occasion. But oh, if they can make that kind of misjudgment about their private life, I mean, you must have known that there'd be somebody there. There'd be somebody following around with a camera. And everybody's armed with a camera now. You can't do or say anything, but somebody's snapping you. Uh, so I enjoyed the fun. Whether it says anything significant about politics or Michael Gove, I don't know. What I do know is this: even the unionist press cannot resist a good story. And that's a motto that we should learn in the nationalist movement. We're so anxious to bash the press. You've got to remember the fundamental rule of placing a story. Will it appeal to their news instinct? I mean, people regularly thunder on and sometimes thunder on at me and say, why was this a story? And I said, because it's news. And there's certain kinds of story they can't resist. Even the most rampant Tory press, the Tory graph. If Boris Johnson did something monumentally stupid in public, they would report it. They can't help themselves. So maybe we should learn something about what constitutes news. I remember once attending, I won't go into any great details, an SNP event. And I took my camera along, and there were politicians in good-natured forum doing their party piece, and it was very funny and a very enjoyable evening. And I posted a little video of one of them, and God, I felt as if the roof had fallen. My email, phone, and everything went off at once and said, "Please, would you withdraw that video?" I said, "No, it was just a senior SNP politician enjoying himself." Yes, but it's something we'd rather you didn't do. So I loyally towed the line. I've still got it somewhere, but I'll resist the temptation to unearth it. So you've got to find. American industry used to have a great. They used to say, Pete, why do these British press get so upset about the sexual peccadillos of their politicians? All the good guys have got trouble keeping their pecker in their pants.
Absolutely right. A point well made. Absolutely. Thanks, Peter. We've run out of time this evening. We were going to have a quick recap of the news, but we're up against the clock. The clock is never our friend on Broadcasting Scotland, and so we won't have a summing up this evening. And what I will say is that is the news on Scotland at 7 this evening. In making these programmes, Broadcasting Scotland relies on the support of viewers and others who value our distinctive approach to culture, news and current affairs. If you would like to support us, then please subscribe or donate to Broadcasting Scotland. You will find the link to do that on the screen now. There are other ways in which you can contribute to our work. If you would like to volunteer to work with Broadcasting Scotland, either behind the scenes or in front of the cameras or in any other way that helps our work, then please visit our website at www.broadcastingscotland.scot and send us a message there. Meantime, we will be back tomorrow at 7 o'clock with the next edition of Scotland at 7, so please tune in and join us then. I'd like to say very many thanks to Peter for joining us this evening and sharing his thoughts and wisdom, his analysis and his experience.
Thanks, Andrew. Can I add a coda to your commercial?
Very quickly, Peter. You've got 30 seconds.
General message. When you're tempted to write something negative about the BBC and mainstream media, instead reach for your checkbook and support Broadcasting Scotland.
Thanks, Peter. And that's the way it is at very nearly Scotland at 8. Thank you for joining us on Broadcasting Scotland. Remember that we are all the Glasgow girls. I hope that you have a very peaceful evening.